A title: Mandatory Reporting. Rebecca Henry, Deputy Chief Counsel, Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, American Bar Association.
In every state, actually, there are mandatory reporting requirements for people who are perceived by the state to be vulnerable and at risk of harm. And sometimes that's children, and sometimes that's vulnerable adults, and sometimes it's older adults by definition. And it just depends on the state where you live, what the different regulations might be. And basically it says that certain people, sometimes professionals, and sometimes just people who come in contact with those vulnerable folks, are required to report when they suspect that there's abuse or neglect or exploitation going on, and report to a state agency that offers protection for those people.
Bonnie Brandl, Director, National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, End Domestic Abuse, Wisconsin.
Almost every state in the country has a mandatory reporting law for either elder abuse or vulnerable adults. And in many states, domestic violence and sexual assault advocates may be considered mandatory reporters. And so what becomes crucial is trying to figure out what your state law is, whether or not you're a mandated reporter, what needs to be reported, and how you will work with older adults if in fact you are a mandated reporter.
Alicia Aiken, Executive Director, the Confidentiality Institute.
Mandatory reporting is a term that, frankly, is getting thrown around a lot, not always with clarity about what it really means. Mandatory reporting means that there is a statute, a law, that requires certain people to report certain kinds of information about certain kinds of violence or vulnerability to a certain place. And the reason that I'm so specific about that is because I have heard people say, I'm a voluntary mandatory reporter. There's no such thing. If you are mandated to report, then it is defined in the law. And I've heard people say, well, I'm a mandatory reporter, so that means anytime I'm in a room with somebody from Adult Protective Services, that means we speak freely. That's not what it means. It is a requirement that if you become aware of abuse to a specific kind of adult, and it's defined differently in every state, but it often is an adult who is 60 or older, or an adult who is vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. If you learn of abuse to that person, then you're required to make generally a phone call to some kind of a hotline or to law enforcement.
Many people watching this video will be advocates, victim service providers, and curious about under what circumstances in their work they might be required to report.
Everything depends on where you are, what state you're working in, and also the protocols of your agency. So that's not a decision that anyone should have to make in a vacuum. Hopefully your agency already has protocols about how and when to make those reports that you should be familiar with. If it doesn't, then maybe you can go to your team and talk about developing some protocols. But also you can work with your peers and with your managers to figure out when is an appropriate time to make that kind of report in consultation with your state law. I mean, look at what the state law requires and when it requires those kinds of reports to be made.
What would a mandated reporter report? In other words, what information are they to report, and would that include even suspicions, not necessarily some sort of concrete opinion, but even a suspicion of elder abuse?
In terms of what a mandatory reporter reports, again, it goes back to what is the statute in your jurisdiction, and I will always emphasize that everyone should always be checking what they're actually required to do and checking whether it has changed, because these are statutes and every year the legislature has the ability to change them. But often what it is a reasonable suspicion or a reasonable belief that abuse has happened or is ongoing, or that someone is in danger of harm. And the important thing to remember about mandatory reporting is that no one thinks that that system requires the reporter to be an investigator. In fact, the intention of the system is that reporters will turn information over to investigators who will then go and seek more information. So you're not under any duty to go looking for information. Typically what a statute will say is it will give you a list of things that you must share if known. And that might be the name and location of the victim, the name and location of the perpetrator. Sometimes it'll say a description of what happened, or what is the information that you received that leads you to believe that there has been abuse.
Logos appear. NCALL, www.ncall.us. Terra Nova Films, terranova.org. Funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women and Elder Justice Initiative. www.justice.gov/elderjustice. A disclaimer. This project was supported by grant number 2014 AXTA K050, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women and by the Elder Justice Initiative, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, or the Elder Justice Initiative.